The Calgary Police Service Auto Theft Team has charged 2 men following a year-long investigation into a series of fraudulent schemes that targeted car dealerships and financial institutions. Throughout this investigation, police identified fraudulent loans and transactions exceeding a combined value of $800,000 and recovered 5 vehicles with a combined value of $410,000. Throughout 2018, 2 men used stolen identities to fraudulently purchase vehicles in Calgary. It is believed that the suspects then replaced the vehicle identification numbers, or VINs, on the vehicles in an effort to disguise the vehicle while they were either resold or refinanced, the same vehicle being resold or refinanced. It is alleged that the men were also able to obtain financing loans through financial institutions for vehicles that they did not possess. These frauds resulted in the victims of identity theft being held responsible for vehicle loans that have been taken out in their names, car dealerships being unable to sell vehicles that had liens placed on them, and legitimate vehicle owners having their vehicles repossessed by banks who were acting on the fraudulent loans. Last October, investigators conducted a search warrant on a residence located downtown and collected a significant amount of evidence. Following that, 10 identity fraud victims were identified and police recovered 5 vehicles from Calgary, Edmonton, and Vancouver. As a result, Sean Alexander Airy, age 27 of Calgary, has been charged with 1 global charge of fraud over $5,000. Mohammed Khalid Al-Shanti is also wanted on warrants for fraud over $5,000 and possession of a controlled substance in relation to items found during the execution of the search warrant. Al-Shanti is described as male, 37 years old, 5 foot 10 inches tall, and 200 pounds. He has brown eyes, brown hair, facial hair, and speaks with a heavy accent. Anyone with information about the whereabouts of Al-Shanti is asked to call the police non-emergency number at 403-266-1234 or you contact Crime Stoppers. And that is the gist of the written statement. I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Sir, do you know how many people were affected by this, innocent victims that were affected by this whole scheme?
Well, it's numerous. So as we mentioned in the release, that we recovered some vehicles. The release mentions 10 identity fraud victims, but I would extend the number of victims to beyond that, in the sense that we're looking at financial institutions and vehicle dealerships in particular as being victims here. They're being targets. Their business is being targeted in order to achieve these frauds.
Is there a case of can this money be recouped, sir?
Yes, in some cases it has. But in other cases, and really the part where we like to inform consumers is around making these vehicle purchases from the criminal element, whether that's via a car dealership or a secondhand sale, for example. And then later on discovering that this element of crime occurred in the background, and then those vehicles being repossessed. It's very often that the victim of crime there is out the money that they paid. So that's certainly a message we'd like to get across is due diligence.
How did they disguise the VINs? How did they do that?
It's quite sophisticated. There's probably 2 streams. One is to create a new VIN altogether. So that's to create a brand new number. And you appreciate that needs to be done with some knowledge of manufacturing industry, the ability to make it credible. The other is to change is to use, I suppose, an existing number from another vehicle, perhaps in another jurisdiction. So what we saw with regards to these events featured, for example, paper transactions where a vehicle was not necessarily in play, that essentially it was a true paper fraud where the vehicle, the VIN belonging to a vehicle, was actually well outside of Calgary in some other jurisdiction, but was purported to be in Calgary on paper.
And so when they're dealing with the banks, how were they able to defraud the banks, but how were they able to, surprise the banks on their actions? I'm curious how that worked.
Yeah, there's many different ways to go about that, I suppose, but a lot of it is just presenting with credibility, I suppose. So in this case, at dealerships, the dealership is acting as an agent for the financial institution or multiple financial institutions. So presenting with credibility and and having that desire to make a sale. And of course, with regards to both the vehicle dealership and the financial institution, their primary focus in their business is to make a sale, is to satisfy their customers. And so we appreciate that, and I think that it's not so much complicity on the part of any of these partners of ours. It more has to do with just due diligence in order to identify these criminals presenting themselves as credible.
And sort of last question, Frank, what was the overall cost of this crime? Just curious.
Well, we've put the number at over $800,000. And it's not uncommon for us to see high numbers. In this particular case, some of the vehicles that we're talking about are very valuable. So one vehicle at a very high value, and you can imagine as soon as you go into multiple high-end vehicles, then the number rises pretty quick.
Since it was such a long investigation, what kind of first tipped you off that something was amiss?
I think it's constantly working with partners, I suppose. So in this case, these offenders are known to us. So that's, and in terms of how they operate and how the criminal element works in situations like this, we did have some knowledge. But it's really getting cooperation from our partners. So in this case, the two biggest partners being vehicle dealerships and financial institutions themselves, but also on the law enforcement side of things, we have good partners at organizations such as Service Alberta and Alberta Registries to help us out.
So they had a history of frauds like this?
That's correct.
And you talked about doing due diligence, what are some ways that all the victims could have protected themselves, including the banks?
Absolutely. I think the number one thing that we have for consumers, the number one piece of advice, it's actually consistent with previous media releases that we've done, and the common theme here, and that is essentially the deal that is too good to be true. So in a lot of cases, the sophistication of the criminals to hide their criminality, it's difficult for the consumer to immediately identify that. But what is identifiable is the vehicle being sold well below market value. So the consumer, a lot of times, we understand, is trying to get the best deal that they can. And a lot of times when that is presented to them and perhaps a need to make that deal before it's no longer there, due diligence steps are missed. And red flags are sort of identified after the fact.
So it's too good to be true, kind of thing?
That kind of thing, yes.
And is there any, do you suspect any larger link to organized crime, any bigger organizations tied to this?
I suppose on some levels, yes, there's certainly an organized effort to pull this off. So in the past, we've been successful in laying organized crime charges in relation to vehicle theft and vehicle fraud rings. We don't have that in this case, but we do see that it requires an organized effort to commit these offenses. And that starts all the way at the beginning of an identity theft victim, for example. So that could start from a purse snatching, that could start from something online where personal information is obtained, and then it could proceed all the way down the line to something like we're describing here today.
Since you talked about knowing these guys already, would this be the same Sean Airy that was involved in the Nathan Gervais case?
That's correct.
Okay. And the Mohammed Al Santi, would he be the same individual charged with assault and uttering threats back in 2013?
I'm not familiar off the top of my head with those exact charges in 2013, but he's known to us, yes.
Sir, will more people be charged? Is the investigation ongoing, or do you think more charges will be pending as other individuals?
It's certainly conceivable that that's possible, but I think in this case, you can tell by the dates where we're describing some events that happened in 2018 that we've already been quite exhaustive when it comes to being certain that all of the evidence has been gathered. The court system requires us to do that kind of due diligence before laying charges. And be prepared for example, if a trial were to happen sooner. In a complicated fraud case, we need to be ready. So in this case, we are. All the evidence has been gathered.
But the Crown needs to be able to connect the dots.
That's correct. And there's some, the Supreme Court of Canada and the Crown's office and the judicial system requires us to, when we're laying charges, to be ready to proceed thereafter. So that's why there's a time delay here where a significant amount of investigating had to occur.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
How is it that there's victims in multiple jurisdictions?
Pardon me, sir. I'm sorry, I missed that.
How is it that there's victims in multiple jurisdictions?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a complicated story to describe, I suppose. But as I mentioned earlier, with regards to paper transactions, it's conceivable that a person's identity could be stolen, as I mentioned, from something as simple as a purse snatching, say, in a completely different jurisdiction, and so they are a victim in their jurisdiction. The event actually took place somewhere outside of Calgary. But a number of steps took place leading to vehicle fraud such as described today in Calgary. So that's how other jurisdictions can be linked to this. And then, of course, just the mobility of vehicles as well. Is vehicles by definition can get from one jurisdiction to another, and we have to work with our law enforcement parties, our partners, to find them in different jurisdictions or even out of the country.